He had survived the battlefield, oceans away from home, a decorated Navy SEAL, trained to fight, to defend, to protect. He carried scars that told stories of bravery and sacrifice, yet nothing could prepare him for the fight waiting in the very country he had sworn to serve. It wasn't an enemy with weapons, but an enemy in uniform, hiding behind power, fueled by prejudice. One moment, he was standing in a courtroom where justice was supposed to live. The next, he was kicked, humiliated, in front of everyone, as if his years of service, his honor, his very humanity, meant nothing. The silence in that room was deafening, but the impact was louder than any explosion he had faced in combat. What happened next wasn't written in any law book and wasn't part of any training. It was raw, shocking, and unforgettable. The question is, when justice fails the very people who protect it, what remains? Before we dive into this suspenseful story, drop a comment with your city so we can see how far it reaches. And if you enjoy the video, don't forget to subscribe to my channel. He wasn't just a soldier, he was a protector, a man who had given everything for a flag that promised freedom and equality. Marcus Daniels, a decorated black Navy SEAL, had built his life on discipline, loyalty, and honor. To his neighbors, he was quiet but respected. To his brothers in uniform, he was the one who never flinched when danger called. Years of service had molded him into someone who carried himself with calm strength, the kind of man who walked into a room and commanded respect without saying a word. Off-duty, Marcus lived. Morning runs through his neighborhood, coffee at the same corner cafe, quiet evenings spent writing letters to the families of fallen soldiers, honoring those who never made it home. But beneath his steady routine, Marcus was no stranger to the uneasy glances, the way some people crossed the street when he approached, or the suspicion that seemed to follow him in places where his uniform wasn't visible. Still, he believed that the country he had defended was better than its flaws, that justice, though imperfect, would prevail. That belief was what carried him into the courthouse that day. It wasn't for himself, but for a friend, another veteran who needed his testimony, his truth. Marcus walked through those courthouse doors with confidence, his medals and scars invisible beneath a plain suit. What he didn't know was that inside those walls, the rules he had fought to uphold wouldn't protect him. In that room meant for truth and justice, something else was waiting, something darker, colder, and more personal than any battlefield he had ever known. Marcus had walked into battle zones where every shadow could hide an enemy. Still, nothing prepared him for the hostility that met him in that courthouse. The air was heavy with murmurs as he entered, the weight of 100 eyes pressing down on him, not with respect, but with suspicion. He adjusted his tie, kept his back straight, the way years of training had taught him. But the uniform he wore now wasn't the one people honored. It was the skin he had been born in, and that alone seemed to place him on trial before he even took the stand. The first sign came as he approached security. A metal detector beeped faintly, though he had nothing on him. The guard's hand went immediately to his sidearm, his eyes narrowing, his tone sharp. Others in line had been waved through with ease, but Marcus was pulled aside, searched twice, and questioned as if his very presence was a threat. The humiliation burned in silence, yet he endured it, telling himself it was just a misunderstanding. But deep down, he knew better. Inside the courtroom, the tension only thickened. Whispers floated in the gallery, and stares lingered too long. Marcus kept his composure, but he could feel the judgment radiating from faces that didn't know his story. He was here to speak for justice, to testify for a man who had served his country honorably. Yet with every passing moment, it became clear the fight wasn't only for his friend's case, but for his own dignity. Then came the confrontation. A deputy, larger than life in his crisp uniform, stepped directly in Marcus's path. His voice was cold, almost mocking. "You don't belong here." It wasn't said outright, but the tone carried all the venom of centuries past. Marcus met his stare, steady and unflinching, but he could feel the room watching, waiting to see how he would react. For a split second, he was back on deployment, cornered, surrounded, forced to rely on instinct. Every move felt dangerous. He tried to step aside, but the deputy shifted, blocking him again. The silence stretched until it cracked with a sudden, shocking act. A shove, hard enough to send Marcus stumbling back. Gasps echoed through the chamber. The force wasn't just physical, it was symbolic, a message meant to strip him of power in front of everyone. Marcus steadied himself, but the memory of every time his skin had made him a target surged like fire in his veins. He thought of the men he had lost overseas, men who bled for a flag that promised equality. He thought of the battles he had fought with courage, believing they meant something. And now here he was, in a place of justice, treated like an intruder, in his own country. Rage, fear, and disbelief collided in his chest. The room seemed to shrink, the walls closing in as the deputy's hand twitched near his holster. For a moment, time stood still. Marcus knew one wrong move could be twisted into justification. The choice before him wasn't survival in the physical sense. He could defend himself easily, but survival of his honor, his humanity, his truth. And as the courtroom watched, waiting for him to falter, the question hung heavy in the air. Would he endure in silence, or would he finally strike back against the injustice that had haunted him his entire life? The shove was only the beginning. The deputy's glare hardened, his chest puffed with the kind of power that needed no justification. The courtroom, a place meant for justice, had transformed into an arena where Marcus stood alone against centuries of prejudice, condensed into one moment. The murmurs grew louder. Phones appeared in shaky hands, recording what they instinctively knew would become a scene worth remembering. Marcus steadied himself, the Navy SEAL in him refusing to bow. His pulse pounded, every beat echoing with the memory of hostile deserts and ambushes overseas. But this wasn't a battlefield in some faraway land. It was here, in the very country he had sworn to defend. And the enemy wasn't faceless. It wore a badge, carried authority, and stood inches away from him. Then it happened. The deputy's boot came up, sharp and deliberate, connecting with Marcus's shin in a blatant act of dominance. Gasps rippled through the chamber. The blow wasn't meant to wound his body. It was meant to break his spirit, to humiliate him in front of every pair of watching eyes. For a fraction of a second, Marcus felt the sting, not of the kick, but of the centuries of cruelty behind it. Every ancestor who had been silenced, every soldier who had returned home only to be treated as less than human. It was all there, condensed into one violent strike. The silence that followed was suffocating. Marcus locked eyes with the deputy, and in that gaze was the war inside him. Rage clashing with restraint, the instinct to fight wrestling with the need to endure. His training told him to neutralize threats swiftly, but his heart told him this was bigger than a single fight. This was a test of who he was, and of how the world would remember him. The deputy sneered, his hand hovering near his weapon, daring Marcus to make a move that could turn him into yet another headline. The crowd tensed. This was the moment that defined everything. Justice or chaos, survival or destruction, silence or defiance. Marcus straightened his back, the courtroom lights casting a sharp glow on his face. He didn't flinch. He didn't bow. Instead, he radiated the kind of power no kick could erase. The deputy's smirk faltered just slightly, as if realizing that his attempt to crush Marcus had only ignited something far stronger. And as the world held its breath, Marcus knew. This was no longer just about him. It was about everyone who had been silenced, beaten down, and told to know their place. The question that lingered, unspoken but deafening, was simple. Would this moment spark another cycle of injustice, or would it finally force the truth into the light? The courtroom didn't erupt into chaos, though it felt like it could have at any second. Instead, There was a stillness, tense, heavy, electric. Marcus stood tall, his presence radiating strength, refusing to let the kick define him. The judge banged the gavel, demanding order, but the weight of what had just happened could not be silenced. Cameras had captured it. Witnesses had seen it. The world would know. The deputy was pulled back, his face flushed with arrogance, but his eyes betraying something else, fear. He had expected Marcus to crumble, to lash out, to become the villain of the story. Instead, Marcus's restraint turned the spotlight directly on the injustice, leaving the deputy exposed as the aggressor. The irony was bitter and sharp. A decorated Navy SEAL, trained to fight wars abroad, forced to battle for his dignity inside a courtroom in his own homeland. In the days that followed, the video spread like wildfire. Social media became a battleground of outrage and solidarity. Hashtags filled timelines, interviews poured in, and Marcus's story became more than just a single man's ordeal. It became a symbol. People who had never worn a uniform, people who had never stood in a courtroom, recognized themselves in his humiliation. Because what Marcus endured was not an isolated moment. It was a mirror reflecting the pain of millions. Yet, Marcus himself bore the scars quietly. He would never forget the sound of that boot striking his shin, not because of the pain, but because of what it meant. That even service, sacrifice, and honor could not shield him from the reality of racism. His medals at home gleamed on the wall, but in that courtroom they had been invisible. He was not seen as a hero. He was seen only as a black man. But Marcus did not retreat into silence. He stood before cameras, before crowds, and he spoke, not with anger, but with unshakable conviction. He spoke of dignity, of the unseen battles that black men and women face every day, and of the need for accountability in a system that claimed to serve all but often failed the most vulnerable. His story became a call to action, urging others not to look away, not to dismiss, not to forget. Because if a man who had risked his life for freedom overseas could be kicked and humiliated in a courtroom at home, then what did freedom really mean? And so the impact of that day reached far beyond 4 courtroom walls. It sparked conversations in living rooms, protests in city streets, and quiet reflection in the hearts of those who had never truly seen the weight of racism before. Marcus's story became part of a larger chorus, a demand for change that could no longer be ignored. He walked out of that courtroom with his head high, not victorious, but unbroken, his dignity intact, his purpose sharpened, and though the scars would remain, so too would the fire he carried, a fire that could not be kicked out, silenced, or forgotten. The question that lingers now is not about Marcus alone. It is about us. How many more times will this story need to be told? How many more lives must bear the weight of injustice before the world decides that enough is enough? Because this was not just Marcus's story. It was, and still is, the story of a people, of a nation, and of a fight that demands every one of us to stand, to speak, and to act. Will we? Or will we let silence be the answer?